biggest lessons learned from the 80 days. One is from being the performance manager, being the person that's shoulder to shoulder with an athlete. To me, that rapport between the athlete and the support has to be really, really tight. You've got to have really close trust, basically.
So welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this two-part episode, we're going to be speaking with Wellham faculty Laura Penhaul and Dan Richards in looking at the race across America, which is a 3,000-mile race from the West Coast to East Coast transcontinental across the USA. So in the first part, we're going to be speaking with Laura Penhaul on her consulting in the race, in the GNC team, and looking at some of the nutrition aspects, looking also at some of the cadence of training and some of her technical expertise. Laura was a team leader for the Coxless Crew who set 2 world records in January 2016. So she rode unsupported across the Pacific Ocean, 9,000 miles, 9 months to complete and 4 years to prepare for. Laura is also the lead physiotherapist for the Paralympic program for British athletics, working in Vancouver, London, and the Rio Paralympic Games. Laura then carried on her experience in elite sport to support Mark Beaumont in achieving the world race in under 80 days, so cycling and circumventing the world in under 80 days. She also supported Land's End to John O'Groats relay record in under 40 hours and the current attempt on the relay record on the race across America. So what we're going to do is speak to Laura, like I said, about how intense the race is, the combination of fast riding versus minimal sleep. We're also going to look at her nutritional advice, her experience from Mark Beaumont in overlaying lessons learned. Then we're going to look at the Blesma team, so the team that Dan Richards is racing with, and her advice to them. So please do enjoy. So welcome, Laura, to the podcast.
Hello, nice to see you again. Or speak to you again, should I say.
Great to speak to yourself. So Laura, we just wanted to really just understand what RAM is, so this race across America, and just maybe pick apart the anatomy of the race and how you've been involved. So maybe if we could just start by asking you how intense this race is, and is it correct that there is no stages, it's just a constant push for 3,000 miles?
Yeah, exactly. That's the biggest challenge with this. It is literally the fastest crossing to get from the West Coast to the East Coast of America. So leaving California, and it's a 3,030 mile route. And straight away they get the big exposures is really the range in temperatures, the extreme environments that they're going to go through. So they pretty much straight away can get into brutal heat of up to 50 degrees, and when they get to like the Appalachians, sort of on the further across and then going across the desert, they're basically, or the plains should I say, they're going to be exposed to that 50 degrees heat and up to 80-90% of humidity. So so there's brutality in the conditions and the exposure as well as the distance, and the point is it's being the fastest, it means therefore it's non-stop, so it's all about strategy and kind of timing of strategy and kind of, you know, for the pairs team that I'm supporting, how we'll go into in a bit, but how we've aimed at designing the strategy is it's just a really fine line between maximizing power and recovery, and that sort of how minimal can you get recovery in order to maintain power across 6 to 7 days, which is 6 days is what their target is.
It sounds brutal, and like I say, just a continuity of brutal mileage across the duration of the race. But so the winner appears to be the rider that can combine sort of fast riding cadence with infrequent stops. So how have you built and guided your advice around the principle of sort of minimal sleep and fast riding?
Yeah, no, it's a tight game, to be honest, and it does come down to individuality and also practice and exposure to what riders have previously had, you know, to severe sleep deprivation. Really, there's a really good book, Hell on Two Wheels, which is an old book. It was written, I think, back in like 2014, maybe, with an individual that looked at a lot of the previous old school solo races, and the solo riders historically run to a strategy of riding for like 24 hours and getting 1 hour's sort of sleep cycle. But they end up in a real world of trouble. That a lot of them have kidney problems and all sorts of things by the ends. Like, kind of, they put themselves properly physiologically and physically just absolutely to the wire of how they finish. Whereas kind of how we've approached it, the team that I'm supporting is with Global Cycling Network, and we've got Mark Beaumont and Jonathan Schubert. Jonathan Schubert is a presenter for GCN, and the two of them are going to go enter into the relay. So in the RAM race, you've got solo riders, you've got pairs, you've got fours teams, and you've got eights teams. There's only ever one rider on the road at one time if you're in a team. And the point is there's a strategy of where you have to cross over and overlap. And if say, for instance, the second rider goes before the first rider has come into that checkpoint, then you get docked time and stuff like that. So it's got to be quite a slick crossover to minimize any time loss. And so with our guys, what I looked at is, to design their strategy, it's a bit of a balancing act between, how do you maintain optimal power and sort of what is their physiology makeup to maintain a good power consistency, as well as obviously what they need from recovery from sleep deprivation. So what I looked at was, okay, Mark in particular, he's been ocean rowing. We've done the 80 days. We've done a number of other things as well, Land's End to John O'Groats records and things. And I know he's used to getting a very small amount of sleep, but what I wanted for both of them is to get at least a couple of sleep cycles in them per day. So therefore, that meant I wanted to give them 2-hour blocks of rest per day. So how I designed their strategy was doing an hour on, hour off in the daytime and through the heat, and that can then therefore be adjusted down or up if needs be. If there's higher wind, it will drop down like headwind or a crosswind, it will drop down to 30 minutes. And same if they're struggling in the heat, it could drop down to 30-minute turns. But otherwise, through the day, they're going to do an hour on, hour off, whilst they swap over to the other rider. And then during the night times, just between the hours of kind of 8 till 6 a.m. the next morning, they're going to do 2-hour stints. And then therefore that allows them to do a 90-minute sleep cycle twice, with 30 minutes of kind of faff time, basically getting some food in, getting some treatment in, changing, washing, that sort of stuff, to allow them to get back on the bike to do another 2-hour stint. So the reason for that was the compromise of, okay, giving them some sleep cycles to recover, allowing them then in the daytime to do the hour turns. But at the same time, if we really were looking at maintaining power, actually we'd do a lot shorter than an hour. We most probably would go, some of the pairs teams previously have done like 15-20 minutes turns. The problem is kind of your support team on the road has to be really slick and practiced at doing that. And the balance that we had was that the GCN team and the performance team that are going to be around them, whether it's mechanic, the drivers, navigators, are all a new team, and they've only done one practice together. And so given that inexperience within the team and the practice with these riders, it seemed really vulnerable to try and do something for the first time in such short stints, because you've basically got to get the vehicles ahead of the riders to get, if you can try and picture it, it's a bit difficult, but if you imagine you've got in a vehicle, you've got the one rider, and that's got to drive ahead, stop off. You've got to get the bike off the back. You've got to get the rider out of the vehicle, onto the bike, ready, set up for them to be able to push off as the rider that's on the road comes in. You've then got to get that rider and the bike in a van, overtake, stop off, get out, and do that again, and just keep doing that time and time again. So when it's kind of 15-20 minute turns like that, that's massively tiring at the best of times for the rest of the support staff. So that's where I've made it an hour on, hour off, and even that is going to be pretty challenging for the support team just as much as the riders themselves. So yeah, it's a big
Absolutely.
balancing act between kind of their power output, their recovery time, but also sustainability of the crew on the road and what's achievable with the experience you've got.
Yeah, the cadence of change there is so short that it leaves the least amount of room possible for error, which is like you said, in an inexperienced team is probably not for the best. But just Laura, as we sort of look into your involvement, how did you become involved into sort of consulting for the pairs record within the GCN team?
Yeah, so it kind of came about because, well, having worked with Mark Beaumont quite a bit, so I supported him on the 80 days, his world record when he cycled around the world in under 80 days. So I did his performance management preparation for that. And then also then worked with Global Cycling Network with Mark and another rider at the time, Hank, who's a GCN presenter, to do Land's End to John O'Groats as a pair. And they broke that record, so they cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats in under 40 hours. And then we did another one as an attempt for a tandem, where it was shortly after, and unfortunately that wasn't successful, but we learned a lot from that, so hopefully we'll go ahead again with that later on this year. So yeah, I've been involved with sort of Mark and GCN, doing some consultancy with them around their performance planning and preparation for the big expeditions. So when this came up, Mark's been wanting to do it as a solo for a long time, and potentially it might be on the cards for next year. And so then therefore this year doing it as a pair was the vision to do it, to learn a lot about the route, the planning, the temperatures, the conditions, basically. So he could really get a feel for the ride and the race itself, to see what he's going to need to do to get him in best fitness and preparation for next year.
So as you say, Laura, it appears to be both a solo race and a team race, and you can enter on either medium. What would you say are the real standout differences in dynamics between support teams for a solo race versus the support team for a team race?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The solo so first and foremost, on a rider perspective, obviously the solo race, it comes down to strategy and kind of the individual themselves, like maintaining that power output for such a long period of time. And as I said, like historically, the rider has sustained like a 24-hour riding pattern with only an hour off the bike in a 24-hour period. The challenge you've got as a solo rider is not just power output. I mean, it's power output, but it's not just that. It's actually the rest of the body as well, the condition of the rest of the body. So if anybody's read the Hell on Two Wheels book, you'll see there that people lose their neck control. So what happens is, sort of by just having to hold their head for that period of time in a more horizontal position, because they're in that very aero front position, when they're in that aggressive position, holding the weight of your head for 24 hours a day isn't something people necessarily think about being an issue, but actually the amount the muscles have to have strength if is a crazy amount, and unfortunately those muscles can fail if they're not getting the adequate recovery. And so you'll see if people Google it and stuff as well, but on Hell on Two Wheels there's great images, well, not so great, where people have literally got to prop their head up. They've strapped like ironing boards to their backs back in the day and put big straps around their chins, because literally their heads are like a bobbing doll. They've completely failed, like complete muscular failure in the back of their necks. And obviously that is probably, and that in itself is obviously extremely dangerous, because then they can't turn their head, you can't you're still going across junctions, and it's a road, it's still normal roads with traffic on. So yeah, hugely dangerous. And those are the sorts of issues I'd say you see more in a solo rider. And from a medical point of view, a lot more kidney issues and severe attrition that happens. Whereas for the pairs, being able to get a strategy where you're getting frequent recovery, but not at the detriment of loss too long on the bike to lose power, is the sweet spot. But what that means from a support team, as we were discussing before, there's a lot more for the support team to be frequently. There's a lot more people on the road. So in a pairs team, you've got, well, for this Ride Across America, for the GCN team, you've got two follow vehicles that sit behind each of the riders, and that follow vehicle is is their bed, is their home, is their kitchen, is their treatment space, everything. So that literally travels behind the rider when they're on the road. It picks up that rider, it drives that rider ahead, and whilst they're driving ahead is where they'll get fueled on that in that vehicle. They'll get a cat nap, they'll get treatment, they'll change, they'll have a wash, whatever. That is their sort of mobile unit, their bubble. And then you've got a third vehicle that will be on the road that is like the hub, so to speak. So that will drive about 4 or 5 hours up the road. They'll stop off. You've got the chef on that one and chef support plus spares and those sorts of things. And so the chef then is cooking for the whole support team, as well as cooking some warm food and prepared food for the riders. And then what happens is the two follow vehicles will cross over with that vehicle once or twice in the day to pick up a box of food and anything else that needs replenishing in the van whilst they're carrying on with the riders. So there's a lot more logistical sort of headache, I suppose, for the project manager when there's more than one rider on the road. Whereas when there's one rider, obviously you can get away with just having one vehicle, but I would suggest you'd have two vehicles still, that one that goes ahead. So then therefore the team can rotate to have sleep patterns as well, so that you got to consider what's the support team actually going through, the drivers, the navigators, the chefs, the mechanics, the performance managers, all of that staff that's on the road. They need to rotate. You can't have a driver driving for more than four hours at a time. And same with the navigator. They need to also get sleep cycles. So it's about how do you rotate within the team whilst the vehicle basically continues to move on and support. And that's the case for both solo and for pairs, or fours or eights or whatever. But as soon as you get bigger teams like eights, then usually in an eights team, you'll have two groups of four. So they still ride as a four, if that makes sense. But half of the four will go well ahead for like a day or like half a day. And then they'll get a proper rest for like 6 hours, and then they'll jump on the road and do the rotations whilst the other sort of four rest. But that's when you've got like a big bus, for instance, to account for more than one person having to sleep in the back. So the difference between sort of solo and any teams is the manpower basically that is required to support the riders on the road. And it suddenly gets a little bit more logistically difficult to manage the moving parts and management of sleep and food and all of that stuff for the team that gets bigger and bigger.
So Laura, looking at sort of the winner of RAM in the past, they sort of usually finish after 8 or 9 days riding, like we were saying before, up to 22 hours a day through varied and extreme terrains that the US has to offer. From your perspective, and maybe from your previous anecdotal experience, what are the key elements of nutrition that you focus on with the riders, Laura, when you're supporting them?
Yeah, nutrition is a massive thing. Nutrition and hydration, obviously, especially in the heat and the climate that they're going through. With this, it's about getting the right energy balance and kind of the macros, like what's the key that they need. There's lots of chat out there around low carb diets, or the sort of the paleo stuff, or all different things, and people that are wanting to do things vegan and that sort of stuff, which is totally doable. But if you actually are looking at top performance, then people, you need carbohydrate to fuel the stores. Yes, you can be a fat adapted athlete, but you still need carbohydrate when you're needing to push high powers. And also during this, you need good sources of protein and frequency of it, so that you can maintain the muscle damage that is basically going on throughout. So you'll never be able to match the amount of protein required or digest the amount of protein required to stay on top of muscle degradation, but you just want to minimize kind of the deplenishment by the end of the race. Also, so first and foremost, the way to look at it is we tend to do physiology testing. So for these riders that have gone now, we linked up to Loughborough University, and they did some basic physiology testing to see sort of really where their drop-offs were. Now, obviously, that's quite a clinical setting, and it's what was good was to then be able to test that for them to do a 1,000-mile ride and then get tested again, like literally as soon as they finish that 1,000-mile ride, to sort of see actually do the numbers stay the same or have they changed. And one of the riders in the GCN group, for instance, wasn't able to finish the test, and that was partly because he hadn't fueled enough, and you could see that in his numbers. So it just goes to show how important, and that was after 2.5 days of riding, and he's going to need to do 6 days of riding for this event. So fueling is really, really important, and really important to get it right. On top of that, if you think, right, you've got to work out what numbers do they need, what size and weight are they, these sorts of things. This is all where I then draw on the expertise after getting the physiology testing. I'll then bring in nutritional scientists to basically look at the athlete, see what the preferences are, and then be able to formulate the numbers of what carbohydrate, protein, fats are required on each hour across 24-hour period, so that then we can work with the chef to formulate a meal plan that makes sure they're getting what they need and what they're expending. And so that's kind of what we did, and we've literally got a full spreadsheet, and the guys that are on the road with these riders now will be inputting everything that the riders are consuming during the ride when they get off the bike, and inputting that and keeping a track of, are they getting enough carbohydrate, fat, protein, and if not, what do they need to dial up, dial down. Now, if you imagine, that means they've just got to fuel constantly, and the gut it needs to get used to that. So it isn't that you can just turn up to a race and be fueling every half an hour for the next 6 days. Your gut would have quite a bit of an issue with that. And it's also what types of things are you feeding the gut, and also think about oral health as well, because historically carbohydrate drinks, for instance, they're just very corrosive and can be very acidic. So that can impact dental health as well as, and so the oral health, as well as impacting the gut health as well. And often those carbohydrate type drinks and gels, those sorts of things, they can really strip the pH because they're high acidity. And more often than not, if anybody's done more than 6 hours of riding based purely on and fueled only by gels and carbohydrate drinks, you'll know that your stomach just starts to repel it after sort of 6 to 8 hours. Maybe you might get to 12 hours if you're lucky. So there's some great products that are now out there. We've been working with a company called Morton, and Morton have got some fantastic science behind the products that they've designed. And long and short of it is, it's ingested the carbohydrate. You get the 100 grams or 80 grams of carbohydrate that you might need, and that's ingested in a format that's like an alginate, and it enables the carbohydrate to pass, to be ingested, get through the stomach, but then not actually get absorbed until it hits the upper part of the intestine. And therefore, it doesn't change the pH of the stomach. It doesn't change the pH in the oral health. So actually, somebody can, and Mark in particular, is able to fuel on the bike purely off of the carbohydrate drinks and the gels without getting any disruption. And obviously, we've trained it, we've trialed it, and he doesn't get any stomach issues. So for him in particular, he'll be fueled on the bike, literally trying to get in 100 between 100 to 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour when he's on the bike, and equivalent to about 100 grams as well, 80 to 100 grams when he's off the bike. But that's where we try and increase the protein and the fats as well when he's off bike in whole foods. So on the bike is carbohydrates through the drinks, and then off bike is where we get more of the other macros. And then alongside that, we're looking at any other additional supplementation to maximize, say, antioxidants, phytonutrients, those sorts of things, to help manage the byproducts that they're going to be producing when they're working at this high intensity.
So it really is extensive, and I think that you've just demonstrated just the levels of scrutiny and detail that you have to go into to really optimize performance at an individual and at a team level. And I can very much attest to, from my personal experience around the gels and around the way that it was almost a forced diuresis, and very sickening when you get the wrong concentrate or indeed the wrong mixture. But so actually attention to detail through all these domains is, as you were saying, absolutely necessary. Laura, just bringing it back to your experience with Mark Bowman, because you spoke about him quite a lot just then, and in the world circumnavigation bike race that he and you were involved in, could you maybe just speak to some of the key lessons you took from that, which can be really pulled over to the race across America?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I suppose it depends on what lens we've got with this. You know, my biggest lessons learned from the 80 days. One is from being the performance manager, being the person that's shoulder to shoulder with an athlete. To me, that rapport between the athlete and the support has to be really, really tight. You know, you've got to have really close trust. Basically, I trusted Mark to not make too many stupid decisions, but he also trusted me to. He knew that I'd never pull him off the road, basically, unless I was really, really concerned, and we would discuss it. But if he wasn't in the right capacity, for instance, you know, severely sleep deprived and not able to decision make, then he knew that I would have his best interest, and I've got his back fundamentally. So trust, I think, in that relationship is really, really important. And then also, if you imagine as a performance manager, you want to kind of create a bubble, because you want to create emotional consistency around the individual. I knew that Mark was going to have considerable highs and lows at different times, and so I needed to be able to support that, be aware of that, and have the insight of it, but at the same time not get too drawn into it that it made me low or made me too high. Like the person that's a support team needs to remain quite emotionally consistent, and I think that's really important. What we found from, say, the 80 days is those people kind of that were brilliant team members to support but would have less experience in the performance space didn't quite have that self-awareness and those nuances. So when they were a bit sleep deprived or down, like that would eke into having a bit of a response around the athlete, which is not really what they need to see or hear. And second of all, actually, you know, sometimes thinking that the support team would be like, oh, doing loads of cheering on and sort of heightening of emotion, when actually, you know, the rider's going through absolute hell. And so if you know the rider well enough, you'll know that that is not what they need right now. It's not the right timing. And by sometimes doing that sort of stuff, it can make the rider feel quite lonely or even more disconnected from the team if they're not aware of what's going on. So to me, one of the biggest learnings is how you create that bubble and that sort of real trust emphasis around the athlete, but at the same time, how do you share that awareness and understanding to the outer team, and how do you also get the outer team to be on board with sort of some emotional consistency when they might not be used to working in that kind of performance environment. That was really insightful. I think on a more specific level, though, that's kind of the team dynamic side of things. On a more kind of medical side of stuff, what was interesting, and particularly with Mark, I would say, you know, he's ridden a bike since he was 12 years of age, and he's never, touch wood, really had any major kind of injuries when he's riding. So when we started to do 80 days, we did a trial ride around Britain, and I just remember he like halfway up through around Scotland, he was complaining of his hamstring. And you know, you don't tend to, he was presenting like he had a hamstring tear, and you don't tear a hamstring cycling. You know, it's not the normal type of injury to get basically when you're riding, because yes, you use your hamstring, but it's not put under the load and tension and deceleration forces which usually cause a tear. So that was really unusual. And because I was a bit sleep deprived, obviously myself, then it takes a couple of days for me to realize what's going on. And actually what had happened is, because he was a bit saddle sore, he ended up wearing 2 pairs of shorts, 2 pairs of bib shorts. So actually what had happened was there was a seam that was doubled up, and then because he was sitting on the saddle, that was then creating compression right over the hamstring tendon. So of course every cycle with compression was then causing irritation on the tendon, and did lead to a bit of, initially it would have been more of an inflammatory response, and then it did lead to a very small tear. So but what was the learning point from that is, he's not that's not a natural type of injury to get. And secondly, if he was to get anything, it's usually something external, like I needed to look outside the box and not just treat the hamstring. And what again was another learning point is reminding myself that I'm going to be sleep deprived, so my ability to problem solve is going to get more and more narrowed the further I got into the expedition myself. So that's why for then the 80 days I had somebody come in to do a 6-day window for me in Australia, so that I could get some time out, make sure I was refreshed to continue the journey. So I did all of it bar 6 days in order for me to get some recovery, so I could be my best self, if that makes sense, to support him. And I think that's one of the biggest learnings, and what I see time and time again in other support teams is that people don't provide the support to themselves to do the support, if that makes sense. I think kind of those in caring professions like yourself, Owen, I'm sure time and time again you would have looked at the shifts that you've pulled, and docs on this, maybe listening to this call, you provide the care and you provide all the advice to patients and to other people, but actually, when do you actually look after yourself? And it's no different to thinking about the oxygen mask in a plane, is it? You've got to look after yourself before you can look after others. You've got to put that oxygen mask on you before you put it on the person next to you. So to me, that sort of taking care of yourself in order to survive and thrive in an expedition environment is really important.
Laura, I think that's excellent advice. And I think you're right. Too commonly it's negated within carers and indeed within support teams. And like you said, it's harder to reach outside of yourself when there's no self-care there. But just looking at a team that WEM are directly sort of know and involved in. So a friend of WEM's, Dan Richards, who is a right arm and shoulder amputee, is racing as part of the Blesma team. So I guess the Blesma team is the Limbless Veterans British charity, which helps all serving and ex-service men and women who have lost limbs in service. But so actively knowing that he's going to be riding as part of a team, how do you envisage the stresses, the strains, and maybe the challenges that they may face, Laura?
Yeah, no, I mean those guys they're a great team, and years ago I supported a group called it's called Adaptive Grand Slam. So they're a team of ex-veterans, all injured in war, that have basically climbed the 7 summits of the world and the 2 poles. And I was lead physio with British Athletics leading into Rio, so dealt with a number of amputees and other different disabilities. And I think, to me, there's a few things I think that will be challenging for them in particular. One is the heat, for sure, is going to be a real challenge with kind of stump management for those that are amputees, whether it's arm or lower limb. Certainly the swelling, but then it's just going to be the extremes of heats will affect kind of the socket. If they've got a prosthetic in situ, then how that socket fits will be really challenged, because it might fit now that's been fitted in the UK, but of course you go over there and it's extreme heats means you're going to get swelling, and then they'll maybe potentially struggle to get it back on. So that in itself, I think, will be a challenge. Also, the amount of sweat that will be produced, and then therefore risk of hair follicle infection or sores that produce, and especially if the socket's not fitting well, that in itself will cause friction and therefore risk of socket sores basically on the stump. The other thing is neurally, some respond really well to heat, like actually that helps to dampen nerves. Others it's the opposite. So it'll be interesting to see as well whether those that get any phantom limb pain, if that gets worse or better, it could go one of two ways. So that kind of neuralgic type pain, whether that's an issue. And that sort of nerve response, I'm not sure if there is anybody on this there's sometimes people will be part of this team that will have like a brachial plexus injury through, say a gunshot wound. So then they've got sort of a fixed flail kind of arm. So nerve pain and also looking after the limb can be quite difficult. So with Dan, I think, he's a arm amp, isn't he? He's both. Is Dan an arm?
He is an arm and a shoulder.
Right. Yeah. So if he's an arm, and if I don't know if he's going to be wearing a prosthetic, sometimes they may have modified the bike to add something that he can lean his stump against, or he may be wearing a prosthetic, which means then he's got the balance, to put some load through that side. What'll be interesting is how he manages the dependency of that limb and the swelling. So again, that in itself can cause pain. If there's diffuse swelling, can cause pain in the stump, if not neuralgic pain as well. So those would be the things that I would say are the obvious. And then because there's symmetry on the bike, they wouldn't necessarily have gone through. There's one thing going through a bike fit, there's another thing really being high performing on a bike. So at British Cycling, the Paralympic team, the whole point is they're trying to help their prosthetics, their setup on the bike to get equal power, so you're not getting too much imbalance across the bike. Whereas with these guys, I doubt they would have had that level of support or training to get really smooth on the bike. So then therefore that means, if you've got a right amputee, it might be that it's the left Achilles that takes more load. So actually you get an Achilles tendinopathy, that type of thing, or you get saddle sores because they're shifting a lot across the bike. So there'll be other issues which will be due to compensations that potentially will crop up and be a problem.
So Laura, as we come into land on a conversation, have you got any sort of final thoughts for people that may be considering a race across America in the future, maybe entering as a solo and or a team for the race?
Yeah, I'd say do it. I think in all seriousness, Ride Across America is a really punchy challenge. It's a big race, well supported, but it needs a lot of thought, a lot of preparation, and it is a stretch goal. Like it's a big push. And the important thing is to get the right support team around you, people with experience that have know what the route is, know what the terrain is, and kind of what it takes to get support team and a rider or team across from the west coast to the east coast of America. The biggest thing for me is I'm always a firm believer. If my husband always laughs at me, but if somebody says about a big goal, I'm like, great, do it, go for it. It's never a no. It's just more about get the planning and the preparation. If you know that's what you want to do, awesome. Now go about, speak to loads of people, read the books, really understand what it's going to take to do, say, for instance, Ride Across America, and then know where you are now in order to do your gap analysis, figure out your plan and your process, and get those small goals laid out so that you just don't leave any stone left unturned. So you make it achievable, as well as, it's always going to be a stretch and a challenge, but you don't want to turn up to do this sort of race unprepared. It's definitely one that you've got to be well prepared, well supported, and then got to go ahead and enjoy it.
Yeah, that sounds really comprehensive, Laura, and absolutely, it's about breaking the larger challenge into smaller incremental steps. But and that's fantastic advice, Laura. Listen, thanks for your thoughts and your reflections today. I really do appreciate your time and indeed your insights into a race such as this.
Great, thanks for having me, Owen, and good luck to Dan as well, taking on Blisma.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the World Extreme Medicine podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you want to meet lots of other risk-taking, rule-bending, and inspirational people, then you need to be in Edinburgh on the 19th to the 21st of November for this year's conference. Tickets are on sale now. Go to extrememedicineexpo.com to find out more.